Hello, I'm Leslie Walker. I'm here with my father, Captain Lewis W. Walker Jr., a retired U.S. Naval officer who's going to tell us about his remarkable 30-year military career. Captain Walker served in the U.S. Navy from 1942 to 1972 and fought in 3 major wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, as well as other conflicts, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dominican Republic, and China blockade. My father was born in Los Angeles County in 1920. He grew up in Southern California, and he landed a coveted appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. After graduation, he joined the Navy fleet as an ensign just 6 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. He spent the next 3 full years at sea aboard the USS McCall, a Navy destroyer, rising from his first job as Assistant Communication Officer to become the ship's commanding officer at the age of only 24. When the war ended, he went on to serve as Executive Officer and Skipper of a variety of warships. In 1962, he assumed command of a bobtail squadron of missile destroyers based in Norfolk, Virginia, and became the youngest squadron commander in the Atlantic Force. Later that year, he took his ships south to participate in the naval blockade in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1967 and 1968, he served in Vietnam as Director of Long-Term Operations Planning on the staff of General William Westmoreland. After Vietnam, he moved to London, where he became Operations Officer for the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Naval Forces for the Eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea. For his service, Captain Walker was awarded 2 Legion of Merit awards and other military honors. He also earned a master's degree in government with a specialty in foreign affairs from Boston University while serving at the U.S. Naval War College. While traveling the world, Captain Walker had many amazing experiences. He was fortunate to meet Pope Pius in person, to dine with the King of Saudi Arabia, to join a private meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt, and to have dinner with the King and Queen of Denmark. He spent a full 15 years at sea and 6 more serving on foreign shores. Early on, while an admiral's aide in London, he met and married a young British actress, my mother, and they had 3 children. We all went along for quite the wild ride. So today, Captain Walker, who is now 96 years old, is going to talk about his World War II experiences. Let's start at the very beginning. What made you want to join the Navy in the first place?
Well, I was about 9 years old when I first became aware of what the future might hold. My father was a chief petty officer serving in destroyers in San Diego, and we saw him regularly. You might say we were actually programmed for a naval life. I was programmed, but I was destined to go to the Naval Academy and rise to a senior officer's rank. My brother was going to be a judge and hopefully run for President of the United States. The time passed by. We lived primarily during the period of the Depression, and most of our life was spent on surviving on about $60 a month. At the age of 17, I joined the Naval Reserve. That was my ticket to get an appointment to the Naval Academy. When I graduated from high school, prior to graduating from high school, the summer of 1938, yes, I made a 2-week trip on the USS Zane to San Francisco as an apprentice seaman. And I think it was at that point that I became fully determined to pursue a naval career. When I graduated from the Naval Academy, I studied long and hard, and about April or May we took the examination, and I stood high enough hopefully to get an appointment. Then one day in May, I got a call from the local post office about a mile away, said, "Do you have a telegram for you?" And hopefully I ran down to the post office to see what it was, and sure enough, it was my coveted appointment at the Naval Academy. I raised it on my hand, and I waved in the breezes all the way home, showed my mother and dad where I was going, and then in June of 1939, I was sworn in as a midshipman, a plebe at the U.S. Naval Academy.
So tell us about your life at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Well, it was a very regimented life. Basically, you might say that plebe year was we marched everywhere. We marched to classes, we marched to meals, we marched to church. The only free time we had probably was on Sunday afternoon. We were not allowed to date, nor were we allowed to ride an automobile. But it was an easy life in a way. Actually, I want to say that we were not hazed in any real difficult way. And on the summer of 1940, I had difficulty swimming each year and had to take swimming lessons in the pool every day. And each year, when I came back to take the test was a little longer. I failed, and I would have to go back and do the swimming all over again. We learned how to sail a small craft, and that was basically our fun element of our life. And we were paid $60 a month, but we only received $2 in cash and a small amount of credit at the local store where you bought cigarettes or toothpaste and that sort of thing. And then every once a month you went to a payday, and there was the balance of your pay was nailed down on the table, and you touched your money, and that there was an officer witnessing to signify that you'd received your pay. At the end of summer life, we went on our what was called our summer cruise. I was in the USS Arkansas, and we traveled up and down South America and up to Boston. And then 30 days leave. We came back as youngsters. That was the term for second class. And it was a relatively easy life.
So at what point during your Naval Academy career did you become aware your class was going to be accelerated because of the war?
At the end of our youngster year, I guess that would be 1941, we could feel the clouds of war hovering over Europe, and it was determined that our class would be cut back from 4 years of study to 3 years of study, and we would graduate in 1942, a year ahead of time. Basically, the liberal arts studies of our class was eliminated, and concentration was on naval subjects.
Did you, at the end of your Naval Academy career, did you have any input into your first duty assignment in the U.S. Navy?
Yes. In the spring, we were allowed to submit our choice, and I put down I wanted a destroyer of new construction. And then we drew lots, and I think I drew a number of 75. And then when we graduated, I was told that I was issued orders to the USS McCall.
So this was the summer of 1942. The U.S. had been at war with Japan for 6 months and was engaged in these battles in the Pacific. And that's where the Navy decided to send you, right? Tell us about your first duty assignment.
When I got on graduation, my mother pinned my shoulder board of an ensign on one shoulder, and my Aunt Callie put the shoulder board on the other side. And we took off for San Francisco via Dallas, Texas, and San Diego, where my mother's home was. Arrived in San Francisco, we had about 10 days there, and suddenly I was told, get down to the harbor the middle of the night, and went aboard a transport, and we sailed out to Pearl Harbor. I don't remember anything on that trip. Got out to Pearl Harbor, we were placed in, we entered actually in the port of Honolulu, and we were met by a band and all the hula girls, all the girls doing their hula dance, and they had the beautiful leis to wrap around your neck. And we came into the naval base, and it was shortly thereafter that I was told to report on board the USS Black Hawk, and my ship was in Kodiak, Alaska, and we departed. The Black Hawk could only make 10 knots, and she was screening a tanker that was making 8 knots. So it was a slow crawl up into the Atlantic waters.
So on this slow boat to Kodiak, did you meet anybody on the ship?
Yes, I met one officer in particular who would be with me for most. It turned out that he also was assigned to the USS McCall. His name was Harold Burton de Benedetti. Called him DeBen for short. He was an engineering officer. He was actually senior to me, but we were the same grade. Both of us were ensigns. But when I became executive officer, he was my junior. He was an engineering duty officer only and could not succeed to command. So he had to bow to my wishes. But we had a wonderful racial relationship and thoroughly enjoyed one another.
So you and DeBen board the USS McCall on August 1, 1942 in Alaska. Tell us about your new ship.
Well, it was one of 9 ships in Destroyer Squadron 6. They were called gold platers because actually they were the new construction, first new construction in the fleet. She was a 1,500 tonner, we call her one piper. She had 1 stack, and she had a broken deck, had 4 5-inch guns. She had an aircraft radar control, and she also had a fire control radar. When I came aboard, I was told that I was going to be an assistant communications officer, and I was taken to my room, which happened to be a small cubicle about 10 by 10, double bunks, one over the other. I got the top bunk, and the coding machine, which I was supposedly supposed to be in charge of, was right alongside the bed. We had a minimum of furniture, and then that evening I was introduced to the naval etiquette of wardroom life. We stood at attention at our seats, standing up, and when the captain came in, we sat down when he sat down. You were not allowed to, I say this is a custom rather than a strict order, but we would not talk about politics, couldn't talk about religion, and we couldn't talk about women. And the first...
How big was the ship and how many men were on board?
Oh, she was a 1,500 tonner, meaning displacement of 1,500 tons, and on her trial runs, she made 40 knots, making her one of the fastest ships in the naval force.
So it was like 300 feet long, 400 feet long?
350 feet long, yeah, 35 feet wide.
How many men aboard?
16 torpedoes. At that time, including DeBen and I, there were 11 officers and about 250 enlisted personnel. Everybody there, the enlisted personnel and the officers were all seasoned combat veterans at this point.
So the day after you board, on August 2nd, 1942, you go on your first mission to the island of Kiska. Tell us about that.
Well, that we were underway in the morning with a couple of cruisers to go out and bombard the Japanese installation on Kiska. The weather was miserable. It was foggy. There may have been some rain in the air, but it just wasn't pleasant to be around. And the captain loved curry, so we had what was known then as four-boy curry. And it was my first acquaintance with that Indian food, and I gorged myself. Towards the end of the meal, the efforts of the wind and the sea and that rich food struck, and I realized that I was in trouble. I grabbed my hat, ran to the leeward side of the ship, and I tossed my cookies. And my hat flew off my head, and it floated away, and I said to myself, dear God, I wish I were under that hat. But I got over it, and an hour or two later, I was standing my watch up in the gun control director that we commonly call the cracker box.
So you went to Kiska, then you went to Pearl Harbor. Tell us what happened.
We went on out to bombard, and that was when I was first standing a watch with enlisted men, and it was close confinement. There were about 6 or 7 enlisted men on watch with me, and I learned to listen to their ups and downs, their sea stories, and I think I bonded with the enlisted men, and I kept my mouth shut. But we fired our bombardment, and as the end was approaching, somebody reported that there was a Japanese submarine periscope sighted, and we turned away from the island and went back to port. And then on later in September?
September, yes, you went back to Pearl Harbor.
We took our trip down to Pearl Harbor, and somewhere along the line, Lieutenant Williamson, my boss, communication officer, got his orders to flight training, and my training intensified because on 1 October, on arrival in Pearl Harbor, I relieved him as head of department, communications officer. And then, shortly after taking over, I discovered that the shipyard had what we call an SG radar. It was a surface radar, and it was just a jewel of an instrument for surface search. And it was available, and we were authorized to have it. So I went over to the shipyard and tried to persuade a commander who was in charge of our overhaul that we should install it. He was reluctant to do so, and he told me that it took 10 days and we didn't have that much time. I corrected him, said, no sir, we have 12 days and we can do it. So he chased me out of his office. He didn't like my contradiction. And that day at lunch, my captain at the lunch table asked me what on earth I had done to aggravate the commander in charge of our overhaul. I told him my story. The next morning, the radar appeared and it was subsequently installed on board. So it was a learning experience for me. It turned out that the enlisted man who was going to be in charge of operating the radar and maintaining it had been a plumber in private life. He was a reserve radioman first class. He was a plumber by trade, but he could copy Morse code at a very high speed of rate of speed. And it was through him that we were able to copy the Pearl Harbor broadcast of civilian news and promulgate it to the crew at large. Also at that time, I became involved. Well, I was involved in decoding from the coding machine, and it printed out on a long tape, and we'd wrap around the ones that were addressed to us. We printed it, we pasted down on a piece of paper, and it was sent to the captain to initial, etc. But the captain wanted to know more about what was going on in the South Pacific, because that was when Guadalcanal was really under heavy fire from the Japanese. So he wanted to know more what was going on. And in that time, we would take these strips and roll it on a pencil, and they would unroll it and read it. He'd pass it over to the executive officer, and they would read it. Then subsequently, I put it in the burn basket and burned it. But
so you're a young ensign. You've only been at sea a few months, and you're sitting here in Pearl Harbor, and this battle is raging in Guadalcanal. And a skipper just back from Guadalcanal comes to dinner on your ship. Tell us about that.
And I don't know his name. I don't remember his name, and I don't remember the ship that he lost. The ship was sunk. But he was telling that he had been on the port side of his ship, and he looked down. His ship was aflame. His guns were firing, and he was trying to control them. And he got things pretty well, he felt, settled. So he walked over to the starboard side. That side was on fire also, flames going. He tried to get things under control there, and he came back to the port side. By the time he got to the port side, his ship was badly listing. The water was up to the bridge, and the only thing he could do was just step off the bridge and start swimming. And I thought to myself, dear Gussie, is this what I'm headed for? Is this the life I'm going to be leaving for the next 6 months?
And indeed, that's where you headed, to the South Pacific in December of 1942. So actually it was November of 42 when you joined Task Force 11 and set sail to join this Battle of Guadalcanal. Tell us about the next 9 months that you conducted operations at sea, cruising anti-submarine patrols, escorting cowers. Where did you go? Went down to New Caledonia, did a simulated torpedo attack?
Well, we departed. There were 5 or 6 destroyers, a cruiser, a tanker, and the Saratoga. There's a sad story there. The carrier, the carrier force had been reduced to the carrier, the Saratoga, and the Enterprise. And Saratoga had been badly damaged in a recent battle, and they had patched her up, but they were unable to take care of one fire room. So, but the battle at Guadalcanal was so critical that she had to go, and we went down with her. En route, we were learning how to handle the SG radar and how to teach people to work with it. And we had the task force commander set up a routine where the destroyer each afternoon the destroyer would go out about 30 or 40 miles ahead of the force, and then turn around, and during the night would make a high-speed nighttime torpedo attack on our carrier. And when it came time for us to do it, we did it. We went out about 35 miles, turned around, started back in, and we were making 35 knots all the way in, and we were using the radar to conduct the torpedo room. I was in the space where the radar was, doing the plotting, telling the captain what course and speeds he should be taking. We made a very successful approach on the carrier, signaled that we'd fired our torpedoes. Of course, we didn't fire torpedoes.
Simulated attack.
We simulated. And the carrier admiral sent a message of congratulations to our captain for having conducted the first radar-controlled torpedo attack. Then we ended New Caledonia for a few days rest and recreation and maintenance. Um,
So around May 40, you were promoted to Lieutenant JG?
well, about routine operations, I say routine, we actually were escorting ships, supply ships back and forth between the various islands in the Solomons and Noumea. And in May, we received orders to go down to Dunedin on the South Island of New Zealand. At that time, Devin and I were supposed to be keeping journals, and we'd fallen behind because we didn't think very much of the idea of such paperwork. And Red Dreyer, who is the executive officer, called us in and told us, oh yeah, we'd also both been selected for JG, Lieutenant Junior Grade. And Red told us that there would be no liberty and no promotion if we didn't finish our journals. So I helped him with operations and gunnery, and he helped me with the engineering phase of our journals. But we got together and we decided that we didn't believe he would read our journals. So we said that the ship had 5 muzzle-loaded old guns. And 2 days later he called us in and said, what's this? And he pointed to our little notes. And we turned pale and we told him we just thought we could get away with it. And he grinned and said, well, you didn't. But we passed, our journals were all right. We got down to Dunedin. It was a quiet little port. I think the bars closed at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so there wasn't really much excitement. But after about a week, we were tailed off to go up to Wellington, and pending the arrival of a troop ship, I think it was the West Point, SS West Point, that was carrying wounded Australian soldiers back to Australia. So we got on our way, headed for Australia and subsequently Noumea. But while we were in Wellington, on one occasion, we had been tied up at the dock, and there was a supply ship that gave us about an hour's worth of supplies, hand carried from one ship to the other to us. And at lunch on this particular day, Devin and I had the duty, so we had to stay on board. Bill Grody was the senior officer, but he said he was tired. He wasn't going to go ashore on Liberty. So he was having dinner with us, sitting at the head of the table. And at 12 o'clock, a messenger from the quarterdeck came in and said, sir, the chronometer is a standard report. The chronometers have been wound and the magazines have been inspected and all is well. And then he added, and the crew is drunk. There was a bit of astonishment and silence on the 3 of us. Bill Grody looked at us and said, so long, gentlemen, I'm going ashore. And he got up and left the table. And Devin and I searched the ship that afternoon, trying to find the location of the alcohol. We never did. Devin was offered a couple of drinks in his search. I don't know that I was. He was a very popular chief engineer.
Now, as you were sailing from New Zealand to Australia, you hit some high seas and saw this electrical
When we
dance.
left, we encountered the roaring 40s, and that's some of the roughest weather that I ever experienced. It was so rough that the watch couldn't be relieved, so we had to spend the night on the bridge with the skipper. I remember one event. Lightning suddenly started to strike, and the lightning streaks went up and down the mast, back and forth across the deck, around the stanchions, and it just a sheer display of electricity for about 5 minutes. And I did not know what it was. I was worried. But fortunately, one of the seamen on the bridge, signalman, had seen it before and knew it was St. Vitus dance, something that very few people ever get to see. But we made our way around the south end of the New Zealand islands, and when we got up to Sydney, off Sydney, we released the West Point, and we considered on our way to New Caledonia. And my assistant as a watch officer was Horace Hazeltine, and we just sort of relaxed. And we knew there were no Japanese submarines in the area, no Japanese aircraft that could possibly reach us. So we were just taking life easy, talking with one another. We did not use our binoculars to search the horizon. We left that up to the lookouts to do, and if they saw anything, they would report to us. Suddenly, we had a report of a sonar attack, a sonar report, and it turned out, and then winky, the flashing signal light came our way, challenging us. It turned out to be that it was a Coast Guard cutter en route to change patrol. But sadly, we did not have the right recognition signals, so it took us a while to sort things out. Meanwhile, the captain we had called the captain for this, and he was sitting in his chair on the bridge, using his glasses to inspect the horizon. So Horace and I, being good little watch officers, started using our glasses. And I think after a few, maybe 15, 20 minutes, he stopped. He was tired and he was dozing. And all of a sudden I put my glasses up and there were breakers dead ahead of us. And I just reacted immediately. Right full rudder, starboard engine back full. We spun around back out to sea, barely missed going aground. And later we found that the ship had concocted a 2-degree gyro error, and our surface search radio, which we depended upon to pick up the lighthouse of Noumea, was inoperative. But so we were about maybe 100 miles away from where we should have been. But we didn't run aground. For that, I was grateful.
And you missed it by minutes. Did you start to think maybe this was a lucky ship?
Well, I knew it was a lucky ship, but that just reaffirmed it. And of course, other events throughout the war doubled down, as we say today, and made it even more.
So now you've been at sea about a full year, and you head into California to escort a convoy to San Francisco.
Well,
then you go to Pearl Harbor?
We started, I think it was in September, back to Bora Bora as a division. Stopped there for fuel, and that's where I got some a hula dancing outfit for my girlfriend. And then from there we went on to Pearl Harbor, and then back to San Francisco for an overhaul at Hunters Point. I had 2 weeks leave with my parents, and then came back, and I found that I had orders to go out to Pearl Harbor for instruction and in Combat Information Center work. So I caught a Pan Am Clipper. Boy, that was living on that aircraft. Out to Pearl Harbor. There were a couple of very important people on that afterwards made an impression on me. But we landed in Pearl Harbor, and I stayed there until my ship arrived. I think it was just before Christmas.
So in January of 1944, now the McCall joins Task Force 58. This is that so-called fast carrier force, and you're headed out to sea to screen the carriers. For the next
the next
many
year.
months, next year,
Yeah.
you're involved in this island hopping campaign where the United States is trying to seize back these various islands from the Japanese. Tell us about some of your
The McCall,
duties.
you'll excuse me if I read it though. The McCall and other destroyers were an integral part of both fleets operating in the Pacific Theater, the 3rd Fleet and the 5th Fleet. The two fleets operated like a tag team, with one taking their aircraft carriers to attack an island, while the other regrouped and came in to attack as the first one fell back to refuel, regroup, and plan for the next one. As a destroyer, we were needed by, there were not enough destroyers to go around, we were needed by both fleets to run screens for the carrier, ASW screens. So we were constantly operating in the battle zone. This led to the slogan that the riders may change, but the horse he keeps running. Now, this began, when we departed, this began a routine that would be our lifestyle for the remaining days in the Pacific War zone. At sea, our day started with going to battle stations, general quarters or GQ, an hour before sunrise. Generally speaking, the sea was quiet, and so were we. An hour later, we would stand down from GQ, and shipboard routine would take over. Meals, housekeeping, shipboard maintenance, and just maybe a few hours of sleep. Often during the day, there would be a sight of a Japanese aircraft, we call them bogies, on a reconnaissance mission that would send us to general quarters if he came too close. Destroyers were thought of as greyhounds of the sea, and the tempo of our operations was such that it required us to refuel at sea frequently, every 5 or 6 days, rain or shine.
So you headed out to the Marshall Islands, Inuiatak. Ship records show that your task force alone shot down over 150 enemy planes during this long campaign. Tell us about some of these raids that you conducted.
Well, our first raids were on the Marshall Islands. You might say this was hit and run. We never saw the islands. The aircraft took off from the carriers, and we pretended we were a part of an anti-submarine warfare screen that supposedly would keep the Japanese submarines from torpedoing the carriers. But we would also be responsible for going in astern, doing flight operations, and acting as a plane guard if a plane went into the ocean, either before takeoff or during takeoff or just before landing, and we would stop and pick up the pilot. Somewhere along the line, in the early part of the year, in the spring of the year, we had a new captain, Captain Carroll, and I became gunnery officer. One of the events that took place that we remember was we were refueling at sea from the South Dakota, and 5 Japanese kamikaze aircraft. I think the record shows these may have been the first one to attack our ships, but they made a pass. We shot some of them down. We broke away, and we participated in a shootout. But then we went back to Pearl Harbor for a short stay in May for overhaul and a little rest and recreation. Then our next challenge was going for the Marianas. And several events, although in a way life is routine, it's dull, it's monotonous, but the adrenaline is always pumping, and you never you could never relax, and sleep was always a premium. And but the first thing I remember was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and it was called a turkey shoot. Early in the morning, we was reported over the shipboard system, speaker system, that there were a large group of aircraft, maybe as many as 70 or more, approaching our force. So we went to they were about 100 miles out, and we went to general quarters. I put on my 45, put on my tin can hat, packed my what we called our possibles, and went up to my combat station in the Fire Control Director. But nothing happened. It just it came about that the U.S. carrier aircraft were able to shoot down, and I think the number is something like that, over 300 aircraft, Japanese aircraft. It literally destroyed the Japanese, the combat capability of Japanese aircraft. The next day, the Admiral decided to chase the Japanese carrier force from which those planes had been launched. And that afternoon, we launched a major strike against their Japanese carriers. On returning, there were four task groups in the area. This involved something like over a dozen aircraft carriers and probably 50 or 60 destroyers, maybe more. But we got all mixed up. And when the planes came back, they were unable to locate their carrier to land on. We did not know which force we were supposed to be with. And I remember that one of the most memorable orders of the Pacific War, the Admiral ordered us all to turn on our running lights. We ran darkened at night, but all the searchlights were turned on, all our running lights were turned on, and we managed to restore order. But two things happened. One, there was a rumor that a Japanese pilot that landed on one of the carrier decks, U.S. carrier decks, discovered where he was and took off and disappeared before anyone could take any action. And the other, we were steaming along about 20, 25 knots. Captain and I were standing on the starboard side of the bridge trying to figure out just exactly where we were doing and what we were supposed to be doing. And the lookout said, "There's a little flashing light in the water ahead of us." The captain said, "All engines stop." And all engines back full. And we stopped. And sure enough, there was a downed aircraft pilot wearing his little flashlight on his life jacket. And when the wave went up, we could see his flashing light. Well, we picked him up. He was in good condition. And returned him to the carrier the next day. And maybe a month or two later, it so happened that he again was shot up when he was coming back to his carrier, had to ditch his aircraft, and he came in and wiggled his wings and landed alongside of us, and we picked him up again. On each one of those pickups, when we delivered him back to his parent carriers, we got 20 gallons of ice cream, which was a real treat because we had no ice cream capability on board ship. And that became a standard of practice. Any destroyer that rescued an aviator got 20 gallons of ice cream from the carrier. And let's see, had I become...
I think you became a lieutenant on July 1 of 1944.
And in May, the orders came out from the Navy Department that we had been selected. And on 1 July, I was promoted to lieutenant. And shortly thereafter, in August, I relieved Red Driver as executive officer.
Before you became executive officer, on
before
July
that-
10th, you went to Guam. Tell us about Guam.
I left that out, didn't I? Now, we were given an order to go in and bombard Guam. And there was a factory down on the beach at the foot of a cliff. And I was having fun firing at the factory, this factory, because every time we hit the chimney of the factory, a puff of smoke would come out. And sometimes an individual would run out of the factory and we could fire a 4-gun salvo at him. But did we ever hit anybody? Did we do any real damage? I don't know. We were very fortunate though, because there was a Japanese battery within striking distance of us, and they did not open fire on us. Meanwhile, when we secured from our bombarding mission, I was stepping down from the director. My rangefinder operator was still watching the beach, and he reported that there was somebody over there sending an SOS by semaphore. Well, I put a great deal of credence in that because I knew that he was a close friend of the signalman on board my ship, and he knew what SOS looked like. So we called down the bridge and called away our landing party, fire and rescue, or whatever it was, to go in and rescue him. And I went down to the boat deck, was standing by to get in the boat when it was being lowered into the water, and the exec, I heard this hollering, and I looked up and the exec was calling me and asking me what I was doing down there. And I told him that I was the head of the landing party and it was my duty to go in the boat. And he said, "No, you're not." He said, "You're my relief, and I'm not going to have you leave the ship." So my good friend Harold Burton D. Benedetti was tailed off to get into the boat, and he got a Bronze Star with a combat star on it.
So he goes ashore to Guam, which is held by the Japanese.
He went in to pick Tweed up. When he must have been about 100 feet from the beach, Tweed swam out to the boat.
George Tweed was his name.
George Tweed was his name, yes. Swam out to our motor whaleboat and brought him back out to the ship. And we put him in our room, in my room, to sleep for a couple of days. And I found out he gave me his journal that he had kept during his tour. He had been on the island when the Japanese invaded, and he had successfully evaded capture. So I read his journal, and it was interesting. And then we transferred him to Cary, and the information that he had was of interest to the admiral, helping the prepare for the landing, and was subsequently made a movie out of his escapades.
So he'd been at least 2 years hiding on Guam while the Japanese occupied it, and suddenly
they were
you were almost leaving the shore when somebody just spotted this little mirror that he was signaling an SOS
with. It was
with.
a semaphore.
It's a mirror-based machine, telegraph machine?
Flags.
Oh, you used flags?
Yeah.
Wow.
Little sticks.
Little sticks.
For him.
Wow. And the movie was No Man is an Island in the 1960s.
Yes, I've never seen the movie.
Well, we'll have to watch it one time. So in August, you become executive officer of the Macaw. That's the number 2 position on the ship. You're basically running combat operations and running ship operations. How did your life change?
Well, I was no longer just a watch officer, no longer just in charge of CIC. I was the number 2 on the ship, and it was my responsibility to maintain law and order, to be sure that people were properly trained, to be sure that the needs of the service were met at every instance. So it was a major learning experience for a young lieutenant, and I enjoyed it. I had some experiences that we won't talk about here, but were memorable to me.
So then in the fall, you're headed for Okinawa and Formosa for airstrikes there. Tell us about that expedition.
Well, that was one of Halsey's
Admiral Halsey's?
Admiral Halsey's sad moments when the Japanese made their last effort to try to destroy the Pacific Fleet, and Halsey misjudged what was happening, and instead of being available to support the landings in Luzon, we were headed up to Okinawa, and I can remember that weather was terrible that night, and I can remember that we heard the calls for help from the light carriers and the small ships that were being attacked by the Japanese forces in the San Bernardino Straits. And because we were too far away, we turned around and did try to help. One of the things that's always struck me also about this time, and there was a terrible hurricane, and Halsey did not realize the significance, and let things sort of, in a way, get out of control. And there were 3 destroyers, I think it was 3, that were short on fuel and were unstable. And this hurricane hit them hard, and they turned over, severe loss of life. And for years I thought that I was at sea at that point in time, because I was in so much rough weather. But it turned out that I was safely ensconced in a nice little quiet harbor for it. So, that's one of for destroyer men, that Admiral Halsey's Typhoon is a legendary story.
Well, as I recall, you're telling the story while you were leaving or approaching Okinawa. There was some heavy fire. You had a little steamline casualty on the McCall. You had to go in for repairs, and is that right?
Well, it seemed like we were always going in for repairs fortunately, it was always at the tail end of an operation, so that it didn't matter much. But what I think you may be referring to is that we subsequently were detached from the 3rd, 5th Fleet regime, enjoying the Task Force 77 for operations in the Philippines. And that led us through the San Bernardino Straits, where we were subjected to a very powerful Japanese kamikaze attack that sank the Omni Bay, and we had to put our motor whaleboat in the water and towed a life raft around, picked up survivors. We picked up over 100 people, and trying to ultimately transfer them some to a battleship and some to a cruiser, depending on the nature of any injury they had. But that was the instance where I was we were firing at the Japanese kamikaze, and the captain was on one side directing gunfire, and I stayed on the other side. That was standard practice. We were never on the bridge on the same spot together in case something happened to take us both out. But I looked up and saw a kamikaze aircraft heading for the ship, and to this day I don't know whether I froze or whether it was just a casual observation. This guy is headed our way, and there's nothing I can do about it. But fortunately, either he lost control, somebody did major damage, shooting at him did major damage to his aircraft. He crashed, maybe about half a mile from the ship. And that was it. Then the next day, we were again under attack by kamikaze, and that was two things that occurred there. One, we were refueling from alongside a tanker, and a carrier was coming up on the other side to refuel, and the carrier fired a line-throwing gun, which has a brass rod about this long, and the small piece of rope is attached to it, and that goes to a heavier line pulled across, and that helps to bring the fueling rig between the two ships connect up. And I felt something touch my chest, and I looked down, and the brass rod had passed between my chest and my arm, gone in the wheelhouse, and was cluttering around down there. And then a few minutes later, I was in charge of the fueling operation while the captain conned the ship. And Erding, who was my talker, touched my sleeve. I turned to see what it was all about, and all he did was point up. I looked up, and there were 3 Japanese aircraft coming out of the clouds, diving on our little formation. And before I could issue any orders to break off, several American aircraft from the carriers came through the clouds, shot the Japanese aircraft down, and it was over.
Wow.
Yeah.
You had a lot of close calls during this war. Now, a lot of these refueling operations and mail delivery tasks required your ships to be pretty close together. Tell us a little bit about the mail delivery duties that you had. There are two tasks at sea. One is the transfer of personnel between ships, and the other is transfer of supplies and munition. And the one that you're talking about, the most interesting one, was that you go alongside and you connect up the lines that will carry your freight back and forth. And you're generally about, at that time, you had to stay around 30 feet apart. And it was a challenging job, and you also didn't have much room to move back and forth this way. Well, in one instance, the captain lost the bubble, and we rolled into a carrier, and the 40mm sponson on the carrier hit the side of the bridge that we were on, and you could hear rivets popping all over the place. A great big hole opened up in the deck, and the stanchion holding that side of the bridge up crumbled. So we had to be very careful for a couple of weeks. When you went out on that side of the bridge, you wanted to be careful not to fall through the hole in the deck when you took your bearings. But it was straightened out finally. And the other was, we had 672 sacks of mail to be distributed. And the weather was terrible, rain, the sea was up, meaning that it was rough.
waves were not very kind to us. So by the end of the day, we were exhausted, but we managed to get rid of it. Oh, well, we did. We made a mistake, and we went along one ship, turned over the lines, and went to deliver mail, and we discovered we didn't have any mail for that ship. And that was a terrible thing, not to have mail, because mail was so important. So we had to break away and go to the next ship. And the captain turned to us and said, if you two ever make that mistake again, I'm going to throw you over the side.
So you had to go ashore various times for lots of routine maintenance and overhaul. And on Manus Island, around about this time, you were in the shipyard. Your captain decides to throw a cocktail party, and you and D-Ben were in charge of this. Tell us about the cocktail party that you threw on the ship.
First of all, you have to realize that Josephus Daniels, back around 1920 or before, did away with having liquor on board ship. So we were not allowed to carry any liquor. That's not to say that somebody didn't violate the rules, but generally speaking, small ships the officers did not carry anything. But we did have beer. We were allowed to carry beer, and it was stored in the paint locker, and the chief postmate had the key. When you came into port, the only recreation for the enlisted personnel was to let them go ashore with several cases of beer and play baseball. And there was a case of beer at each base, and when you reached the base, you got a bottle of beer. Reached second base, you got another bottle of beer, and so on. But the instance you're talking about was, we'd had some touch and go with the ship repair facility, and they'd done a very nice job and been very helpful in getting our repairs accomplished. So a day or two before we were ready to report to go to sea, the captain decided to give a cocktail party on board ship and to invite the shipyard personnel to come down and imbibe. And he called me aside and told me to spike the punch. I also knew that the commanding officer of the repair facility was a teetotaler, a strict teetotaler. Anyway, I sent Ben, you recall, the chief engineer, my buddy, over to the refrigerating unit on the island to get us some ice, because we couldn't manufacture ice on board ship. And he went over, just before noon. And when 4 o'clock rolled around and there was no sign of Ben, so I decided I'd better check up and see what might have happened. I commandeered a Jeep and went out to the refrigerator unit, got the door open, and Ben and Rudy, who was with him, his assistant, both of them apparently had imbibed a little bit and were sound asleep. Whether they'd passed out or not or what, I don't know. But they were sound asleep in the refrigerator unit. So I hustled them out, sobered them up, warmed them up, got them back to ship. And we had a gay old party. And I remember hearing that the ship facility commander asked our skipper, said that it tasted rather strange what was in it. And my captain pleaded innocence, said, I don't know, my officers prepared it, and that was it.
So let's talk about the Battle of Iwo Jima. It was one of the fiercest battles in the Pacific during World War II. Some 500 naval ships, of which you were one, carrying 70,000 Marines, were destined or intended to land on Iwo Jima and take it back from Japan. This proved to be a very costly battle, with the loss of 2,000 Navy men and over 20,000 Marines. It was a month-long battle, and I gather you were in it from beginning to end. So tell us about your time at Iwo Jima.
Following the Lingayen operation, we had been declared unfit for, with a division. Our ships, the 4 destroyers, had been declared unfit for combat duty, and we were ordered back to the States. The division got as far as Ulithi, and while we were at anchor there overnight, the Commodore, the commander, our division commander, got orders to provide 1 destroyer to join USS Izzard, another destroyer, and they would escort, I think it was a cruiser or battleship, I've forgotten now, escort them to Point X-ray. We did not know where Point X-ray was, and we weren't particularly concerned, because we thought when we got there, we would then turn west and continue our trip to the U.S. But when we arrived at dawn on the 19th of February, I think it was the landing date for the occupation of Iwo Jima. And that was a real fierce battle for the whole 6 weeks. We fired our guns almost every day, fired more guns, more shells were fired than in total our whole time in the Pacific, in the war zone. We ran out of food. We subsisted on beans and rice for a couple of days. We were constantly going in for more bullets. One day we received a Marine major coming out, and who was to direct our gunfire. And I took one look at his eyes. I've never seen so much death mirrored in a man's eyes. I've always remembered it. But we did the job. And then along towards the end, we were patrolling on the north end of the island, and we were told to stay outside of a certain line because there was a known Japanese battery on the coastline, and and the line was the extreme range for that battery, so we stayed outside. We had just secured from general quarters. I'd come down, was standing on the bridge, having a few minutes with the bridge personnel before I went down for breakfast, and I looked up, and the USS Terry came steaming by, crossed in between us and the battery, and I thought, well, something's going to happen. And sure enough, the Japanese opened up on their 3rd volley. They scored a hit on the Perry that paralyzed her engineering force, did major damage, killed a lot of people in the damage control party, and she ground to a halt. We called away our fire and rescue party, put our chief engineer, Lieutenant Rudy, and sent him over. He managed to, he afterwards reported that he found the ship in chaos, and he managed to restore engineering, restore order in the engineering spaces, got the ship underway, and he came back. But that was the end. And then shortly thereafter, we headed back. We stopped in Pearl Harbor, and I remember that the captain had gone over to call on Admiral Nimitz to make his after-action report, which was customary for any ship captain. And at that time, the battle in Okinawa was going hammer and tong, and the destroyer force in Okinawa was taking a terrible beating. And Admiral Nimitz asked my skipper if he could turn around and go back and help out in Okinawa. And my skipper said, no. He said the ship is at the end of its useful life. We were being held together by baling wire, and the crew's pretty tired. So I said, well, I'm glad you said no, Captain, because if you had said yes, I think half of the crew would have gone over the hill in Honolulu, and I probably would have been at the head. So we had a few days there and then came back to San Diego, what I think was in April. And I had a chance to get together with my mother and father. I remember that our captain decorated about a dozen of us with Bronze Stars and Commendation Medals, but St. Pac denied the awards, so they never came to pass. We went through the Panama Canal, came up on the far side, and the Atlantic, went up to Brooklyn, and went into the Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn for a serious overhaul.
So now it's August of 1945,
No,
and Germany has already surrendered in May. And tell us, how did you learn about the end of the war, about Japan surrendering? What do you remember about that?
Well, it's kind of, well, you know, I think what you're getting at is that we learned that Japan had been hit by the atomic bomb, and that harked back to the fact that early on, I think in January of '44, Horace Hazeltine had come back from his gunnery school, reported to us, and he said that he had read Scientific American, and from the article that he read, he deduced that U.S. was preparing a monstrosity of a bomb, and that it would shortly be dropped on Japan, and that would end the war. I don't remember whether he used the term nuclear or not. I think he just said that it was a huge bomb. And I guess the big thing that happened there was towards the end of the overhaul, we were tied up in Brooklyn at a pier, and we had just received a group of prisoners who were being released, who had been released from, they were ex-sailors, and they had been released from prison on good conduct to report to us. And one of them, they had to report at noon to the quarterdeck watch, and they were known to prisoners at large on board ship. But one of them managed to sneak off the ship and had gone up the head of the pier and imbibed heavily in liquor at the bar restaurant that was at the head of the pier. When he came back to ship, he was having trouble navigating around, so the quarterdeck watch realized they had a problem on their hand, and they called me as the executive officer to come out and decide what to do. I came out and saw that he was indeed under the influence of alcohol. I said, well, put him in the sick bay. That was our dungeon, so to speak. And tomorrow morning, when the captain comes aboard, we'll take him to captain's mast and decide what to do with him. And then I turned around and started back up the quarterdeck to the wardroom. And all of a sudden I heard, I was about halfway up, and all of a sudden I heard this clatter on deck behind me. And I turned around and looked, and there he was. There was this drunken sailor with a screwdriver that was about that long, stretched out on the deck, and the screwdriver had been pointed right directly at my back. He had been tripped by a gunner's mate that was standing nearby, and he had fallen, and that was the clutter that I heard. So they packed him up, and I had the doctor certify him unfit and packed him off to hospital and where I was supposed to go.
Once again, You're very lucky.
Yeah, I was very lucky.
The war has ended now. What happens to your ship?
Well,
You've been overhauled, but it's decommissioned, right?
yeah. Well, we're still in commission. We made our shakedown cruise, and then I guess it was in September we received orders. This is September '45. We received orders to go to report to the shipyard in Norfolk for decommissioning, and that was where we went. At one point, the captain decided that he was a reserve officer and a very fine person. He decided that he'd had enough. He had the required number of points to be released from active duty, so he sent a message to Bureau of Naval Personnel in Washington and said, unless otherwise directed, on the following Saturday, I'm going to turn the ship over to Lieutenant Walker. And sure enough, nothing came. So on the following Saturday, I think it was the 1st of October, he turned I relieved him as commanding officer of the ship. And I guess I had command for about 2 months. The only outstanding thing I remember there was that at one point I received a request saying, did I have enough crew and etc. to take the McCall around through the canal and down to the Bikini Atoll for use as a target ship in the Bikini upcoming Bikini experiment. And I replied back that all of our supplies had been landed, all of our spare parts had been landed, and I only had 15 people left on board. So it was virtually impossible for me to get underway, and that was the end of it. So on 1 October, on 1 December, we hauled down the commission pennant, and the 15 of us walked off the ship. And just ahead of me was a gunner's mate who had been on the ship from the beginning. And when he handed me the commission pennant, which had just been hauled down, I asked him, Gunner, where was the liquor hidden back in Wellington? And he looked at me and grinned and said that it was down the muzzle of the number 1 5-inch gun. And
back when the crew was drunk.
And that's when the crew was drunk. And I grinned back, and we left the ship, and I got my 1942 Buick and headed for Roadmaster, and I headed for San Diego.
So you have just turned 25. It's a week or two after your 25th birthday. You've been at sea for 3 full years in an intense war. How did you feel at that time about your 3 years of living on a tin can during such an intense war? And how did you feel about the end of the war?
Oh, because along with everybody else, I was glad the war was over. For me, I was mentally exhausted. Physically, I had a polynoidal cyst, but that was no big deal. But I was just glad not to have to face anything early on a Monday morning.
Did the war and your experience as a young ensign leave any impression or imprint on the kind of naval officer you became?
Well, I think it left an indelible impression because I succeeded. I started out being very close to the enlisted personnel. I learned how to listen to their tales, and I learned what makes a crew happy. And I also came to grips with naval discipline and how a ship should be run. And that sort of stuck with me for the rest of my naval life. I think I was always a wartime officer I was never a peacetime officer in my lookout, my attitude of sea duty.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it meant that from my viewpoint, your ship, you had to be ready for combat. Your personnel had to be trained, and they had to be willing to respond to immediately to whatever challenges they were faced with.
So you were ready for difficulties in war and anything that might happen.
That's right.
You developed a constant state of readiness in your life.
Yes.
That's very interesting. Well, we're grateful for your service in World War II. Thank you for telling your story today.